There we go. Okay, all right, and we're recording. So, hello everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. This is the fourth installment of our Bad Buildings webinar series. So if you've come to all four of these, thank you so very much for sticking with us. My name is Kelsey Romer. I'm an AmeriCorps member with the Preservation Alliance of West Virginia, and I do my national service with the Northern West Virginia Brownfields Assistance Center and their WVU Bad Buildings program. So as I mentioned, we've been doing this series since January now. So we're gonna talk today with Nicole Diaz, whom you met back in January when we started. She's the Bad Buildings Project Associate. She's gonna join Nick Downer, who is the VP of Software, is that correct, of Loveland Technologies. Yep. So we're gonna talk to you about parcel data, which is something that's very confusing for sure. If anyone's ever had to do some research on properties and get that sort of data, it can be a little daunting. So they're going to talk to you about that and how Nick's software, LandGrid, can help make that a little easier. We're going to use the chat software today as well. So if you have any questions, like always, we'll do a Q&A at the end of the show. So please put all your questions in there. If you have any technological issues or anything like that, I'll have my contact as well. So you can let me know and I'll try to help you out with that. But otherwise, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Nicole and let her tell you a little bit about how Bad Buildings uses that kind of parcel data.
Hello, everyone. In the Bad Buildings process, there is a point where we need to look up a lot of different information on the different buildings that we have. And in the past, we have had to use a couple different sources to gather all of the information we need. We would need information like any tax information, when the structure was built, who owns it, anything like that. So we would have to use a couple different sites to get that information, which is tedious, but thankfully, we were able to do that in the past. But in October of 2019, I believe, Carrie and I traveled to Atlanta. We went to a Reclaiming Vacant Properties conference, and we attended a session about parcel data, and that is where we met Nick and the Loveland crew. And ever since we have started utilizing their software, the process of looking up all the information for the buildings is now streamlined and goes so much faster, and there's a lot of other cool things that we can do with it too that I'm going to let Nick explain because he is the expert. So I'm going to toss it over to him so he can further explain the program.
Cool. Well, thanks everybody for having me. So my name is Nick Downer. As Kelsey said, my title is VP of Software at Loveland Technologies. And my presentational style is generally concise and hopefully painless. I like to sort of roll things out and look at some cool images and then mostly discuss from there. So I think we're going to do a couple things here today. First of all, I want to do a quick run through, and I'll share my screen here as I'm talking. Let's see if we can get this rolling. And I want to do just a quick background of who we are as a company and sort of where we started at, as well as what we do now. And then sort of at the end, I want to do a quick sort of walkthrough of the kind of stuff that Nicole and Kelsey use it for, as well as what you all in sort of various aligned fields might want to get access as well for. So it looks, you guys can share my screen okay? Or see it okay? Cool. All right, so I'm gonna run through these quickly. So who the heck are these guys? What do we do? So basically the answer is three things. So the first thing is the mildly insane task of stitching together publicly available property data across the whole country. So in terms of scale, we're talking, I believe we're up to somewhere between 147 and 150 million parcels, that is properties across the US that we have data for. We assemble it, we put it together, we add some extra information that we are able to add to these parcels, and then we license that to various folks who are interested. Two, we provide an online tool so that people can work with the data without needing to be a GIS expert or having spent years learning how to work with mapping software. And then three, maybe most aligned to what we're talking about today with bad buildings is we work with folks who are trying to use maps and property data to improve their communities. Historically, that's been angled at sort of like the built environment and housing distress. And I see the chat flashing there. I think rather than distract myself by reading them now, I'm gonna hit them at the end. But I will get to whatever you guys are asking there. Okay, so let's dive into it. So how did this company start? So our headquarters is in Detroit, and the origin story starts back with the housing crisis in 2008 and really reached a peak in 2014. And the basic arc there, I'm sure you guys are broadly familiar, but the city of Detroit has sort of been a poster child for housing distress since the housing crisis. The city of Detroit knew it was hurting. It was obvious that there were lots of vacant buildings. There was lots of issues related to taxes and how people get taxed. But the core issue is you've got a lot of empty buildings, and you've got buildings that have declined to the point that they're not really rehabilitatable. And so the city of Detroit was like, look, guys, we need help on the state and federal level. And basically the answer they got back was, well, so what's the scale of the problem? Like, are we talking 1,000 vacant buildings? Are we talking 100,000 vacant buildings, right? And nobody knew the answer, interestingly enough. And the reason is essentially because nobody had been collecting that data. Nobody had actually hit the ground and done a tally. So Loveland stepped into that void and put together a surveying effort whereby we visited every one of the 387,000 properties in Detroit. It's a big city. Took photos, answered questions about, does it look occupied, not occupied, boarded up. So it was a really big effort. And the result of that was essentially hardest hit funds, if you guys are familiar with that program. Detroit was able to go to bat with hard numbers using the data that had been collected, and was able to translate that and bring home funding to deal with the worst of the worst buildings. Now, there's obviously a long way to go in Detroit, but a lot of the worst have been demolished. I think more than 5,000 properties have been demolished at this point, and that could be an underestimate, so don't quote me. But so this was a very concrete example of how you need property data at that kind of a really granular parcel property level to be able to affect policy and affect neighborhoods on the ground, right? So as we sort of were working through that, it became apparent that this is something that was useful for Detroit, but also more broadly across the country. We had folks from other places reaching out. And so that sort of led us to start expanding beyond Detroit and Wayne County, Michigan, and see, oh, well, what other public data is there? Can we get it on our site? Can we make it available to everybody? And so that brings us to basically where we are today, where we have a nationwide data set. We work with folks across the country, and we're really proud to be supporting a very wide variety of efforts, which I can get into in detail if you all are interested once we get to the Q&A, but it's good stuff. And so with the web platform, we wanted to go through and sort of make it as easy as possible and as user-friendly as possible for folks to just get access to basic information. Nicole noted that it's basically the case currently, right, that if you want to find even something as basic as who owns a property, you are effectively embarking on a scavenger hunt, right? You're going to need to know specific things, like, for example, that the county auditor is generally the place that collects the data. You're going to need to figure out who that is. You're going to need to go to their website. You're going to need to find an address search, and you're going to be like 25 clicks in and have spent 15 minutes before you find much, right? It's a painful process. It's doubly painful in places that have sparse data, places that don't update their data as often, right? And so in some ways, you're only as good as the data that you can get from the county, and that's true for what we show on the site as well. But having it in one place is a godsend if you're working, especially across counties. If you're working at the state level, right, like you're talking dozens of counties, huge pain. So better to find it all in one place. So on a basic level, that's what LandGrid does. You can do that on one website, click from parcel to parcel, jump between counties, no problem. We also have some other tools that enable you to sort of get down deeper into things by being able to what we call filter. Those of you who are tech mapping types might be more familiar with the term query. But basically, that allows you to do things like, okay, I want to find all the properties owned by X, or I want to find all the properties that are valued less than X in my city. You can find them, they highlight on the map as seen here, and you can then export that data. And then the other big piece that you're able to do, it's the LandGrid app. If any of you are interested in pulling it up and downloading on your phones to play with it, we have a nice free version. But if you want to look this information up on the go, we have a LandGrid app. And that's also the vehicle that you can use to collect data. Just like happened in Detroit, you can set up a survey for yourself and collect photos and whatever data. So that's another piece. When you submit, we have a survey set up and you submit a post that has, like, let's say a photo and occupancy or whatever. It uploads to the site as well, so you can see it in real time, and then you can see it on the map on your computer. And then finally, once you've got all this data, whether you've collected it or whether you're using our data, or whether you have a spreadsheet that you want to attach to addresses, all of which is possible, you can then export that data out in a headache-free way so that you can pull it out as a spreadsheet and pass it to other people. Or if you're mapping inclined, you can pull it out in a GIS format, right? So for mapping, if you want to look at it sort of like on a spatially on a map. So that's the, like, really quick, I would say almost elevator pitch style of this whole thing. I'm gonna stop really quick, and then I would be more than happy to jump into a live demo if that's helpful for folks. But I feel like this is a nice breaking point if anybody's got questions right now. Anybody? I'll leave it a couple seconds here.
Yeah, I don't have anything in the chat yet so far. Oh, just kidding, Paula. Hi, Paula. How often is the data updated on the website?
Yeah, so I mean, the answer is your mileage may vary based on the county. The more helpful answer is we get to every county that we have a source for at least once a year. That would be like the party line from our company. We are in reality close to being able to update things closer to twice a year at this point. So I'm going to say, you know, let's average out and say like every year to 10 months, I think you can count on an update. Sure. I can't speak to Morgan County specifically. What I would say that you can do, if you go to, if you're so inclined, Charles, what you can do is you can go to landgrid.com, and then under, I want to say the tab is solutions up at the top. There's a data store link, and then you'll be able to navigate to Morgan County, and one of the fields you'll see will be the update date. In fact, I could actually show that if folks don't have other questions. Maybe I'll start my demo there so we can look at it. Oh yeah, thanks for dropping that in. So, okay, so here's what I'm talking about. So if you go to landgrid.com and then you go to solutions, you can go to data store. And while this is not the interactive get down to the parcel level that I'm walking you through right here, this would be like a good, quick, simple way to figure out what the the last update refresh is. So I'd go to West Virginia here. I'll go down to Morgan. If I could spell, that would be super helpful. Okay, cool. All right, so we see here, actually, this is very recent. So February 1st, 2021, we last pulled the data for Morgan. Cool, let me get this out of the way here. All right, I was thinking that I'm gonna jump into a live demo quickly so you guys can sort of see some of this stuff in action unless there's any other imminent questions here. What do you guys think? Good? All right, so this is the general interface that you can see here. I made a project so we can dive right into it in Beckley, West Virginia. And apologies in advance if I mispronounce any place names in West Virginia. I am not super familiar, and so that will be on me. But I feel pretty safe with Beckley, which is one of the reasons I chose it. So let's look at one of those use cases specifically, right? So here we are, we're looking at Beckley. Let's say that I care about a specific neighborhood. I would probably draw a focus area. And we have tutorial videos for all this on your site. So if I go through something really fast, you guys should be able to find like a step-by-step that you can look at your leisure at. But let's say that I want to look at a sort of like a, you know, I've got a neighborhood boundary. This looks like a weird one, but let's go with it. You know, click on the points. Let's call it sample area. Save and go to area. When this finishes saving here, you can see that it sort of is bounded here. And so now let's say that I want to find, for example, one of the fields that I think is really cool for communities and neighborhood development is we have USPS vacancy data. So that means that what does the postal carrier, right, the person who delivers your mail, think that a given unit is occupied or vacant? So obviously not vacant lots, but we're talking about if structures are vacant. This is one way to tell. So let's say that I want to find USPS vacant buildings here. I go into filter, I choose yes under the vacancy indicator, and I hit load on map here, and you can see that they pull up, they're highlighted in purple. So from here, I could manually go and click on specific, properties, and I could look at all of the information that we have there. Often we'll see imagery, it looks like it's not in Beckley, as well as owner address, where they get their mail sent to, which is interesting if you're trying to track down previous owners, the value as appraised by the county, number of structured, all this stuff. There's a big list that you can scroll through. So you can get specific details and start to work on individual properties if that's interesting. But also you can see what the total is in your area. So down at the bottom here, you can see that it's saying right within the area that we've just made, where USPS is yes, meaning it's vacant, there are 128 properties that fit that description. So within this area that I just arbitrarily drew, right, 128 properties are vacant. Now, it's always important to note that nothing is 100% accurate, right? Like we're relying on the postal carrier here. So there's some level of error, but I've done a lot of ground truthing of this data. And in my experience, we're looking at about 80% accuracy. And that I think may go up in some areas, right, or down. But that of the places that I've looked, that's about right. So you got your data, you say, okay, I've got 128, and already, right, like if you are trying to, let's say, apply for a grant, if you're trying to figure out like what the scope of the problem is, you're already one step there. Let's say that you want to pull these out as a spreadsheet because you want to show up and talk to your political representative and say, look, here are the properties that appear to be vacant, right? What you can then do is click on list over here. And when this finishes loading in a second, you'll see that it'll be a spreadsheet view of all of the information and all of the properties. And then down here at the bottom, I can click download CSV. It'll download it. And when I open this here, well, you guys probably can't see this screen, but it's an Excel spreadsheet of just what we're looking at. So I won't bore you with that. But it's as simple as that, and it's super helpful, I think, to be able to do those kinds of things just quickly and easily. And then, of course, on top of that, right, you can create your own survey, and you can go out and ground truth this if you were so inclined. So let's say you've got 128 properties on your list now to go visit. You hop in the car after having made your survey, you know, so like your first question might be, is this property vacant, or whatever you may be interested in. Hop in the car, go visit these, and then you can add photos and a sort of a ground truth opinion about whether it's a property that needs to have something changed, right? Or something that might get on one list or another, or be in line for, you know, city funding to fix up a rundown porch, or whatever the case may be. You can sort of choose your own adventure, but the possibilities are there. And it's really nice to, you've got the base data preloaded, and then you can sort of bring your own stuff in as well. So it's a nice place to sort of see all your things together. And with that, I think I'm probably gonna stop and just ask Kelsey, have I forgotten anything major?
Nothing major, no. So everyone go ahead and throw your questions there in the chat if you have any, but yeah, if since we're talking about that survey right there, that was one thing that I was gonna talk a little bit more about, if that's okay with you.
Yeah.
If you're ready to switch to that? Okay.
Sure.
Yeah. So before we were talking about that survey and how that really just overlaps perfectly with what the Bad Buildings program does. And Nicole, feel free to jump in here on this too, because that's kind of, you know, step one with the Bad Buildings program is going out and doing those surveys in your community to figure out the conditions of X number of buildings on X number of streets. So that survey tool right there, you know, correct me if I'm wrong, Nicole, but that's That's perfect for this, right? That's something that's so easy for a community to access.
It is absolutely perfect, and unfortunately, it's not something that we have not got to utilize the like survey on mobile app feature because of COVID in the past year. So that's not something that we have been able to really utilize with the communities yet. But we're looking forward to being able to use that in the future and seeing how much it even streamlines our process even more.
Yeah, for sure. And is LandGrid something that if someone wants to be a bad buildings community, if that community applies and they join the program, do they get access to LandGrid through us, or is it all the free online web platform? How does that kind of work?
Yeah. So I don't want to step on Nicole's toes here. She can tell me I'm wrong, but basically I think there's a couple ways that you can slice that. So the first answer would be yes, if you're working closely with Bad Buildings, they could add you literally to the account that Bad Buildings has, right? Because you can just sort of add members at the level of subscription and sort of partnership that we're at. If you are it sounds so bad when you say like a lone rogue, because that feels like there's a value judgment there. But if you're like on your own, either as an organization or as just an individual person who wants to use this stuff, yeah, I would say you can easily do so. You can go and you can sign up for a free account and you can basically use it as a viewer. Similarly with the app, you can see all the parcel data all day. I think the USPS vacancy in particular may like a feature, but you can see all the ownership information for free, the public county data. And then if you're so inclined to get into the surveying and using the tools that we sort of briefly went through here, it's just like $10 a month. We try to make it like a very reasonable subscription for a single person to get access to this stuff too.
We have a question from Susie. Is the city of Charleston a user/subscriber? I don't know if you are able to know that or not. She might have to reach out to someone at Charleston City.
Real quick before that, Nick, I'm sorry, this is Carrie.
Yeah.
All of our communities do have access as members, and so if you're a Bad Buildings community and you're not already connected to this and you want to be, then just reach out to Nicole and she can help move if you did your inventory a long time ago, we can translate it. Nicole can help migrate it into that. You don't need to do it all over again. You probably need to update it, but you need to do that anyway. And she can help you do that. And we did work with the west side of Charleston, Susie. So they do have access through us through that, but I don't know, Nick, if you have an answer on that.
No, I think that's a much better answer than I would have given. So thanks, Carrie.
Okay, yeah, that's great to know. I definitely want to reemphasize that in case anyone missed that, didn't catch that bit. The website is free. You can go on and just look things up. So you may not have all the higher levels of functionality and everything, but anyone can use this. And I tried it personally with a research project that I'm working on for a very small little abandoned school that I'm trying to research. And I did it outside of the Bad Buildings work, and I still found the same kind of data that I would have found if I had just gone straight through, the painstaking parcel data process. So it really is a helpful program, and I highly recommend it already.
And the app is great. I've used it a lot back when I was allowed to travel. Because it knows where you are, right? So if I'm out visiting a site that's not related to our Bad Buildings Park, which is the primary way that we use this, there's always a question, right? While you're standing there with community members, who owns that property next to us, etc. And it's a really great and usually loads very quickly, even in very rural parts of West Virginia. I can attest.
It's good to hear.
Yeah, and that kind of goes to another question that I had. You touched on it a little bit earlier, but we're sort of at the mercy of the data that's provided, right? That's always the issue here. And I think most people that live in West Virginia and have had to try to do this kind of research have found out pretty quickly. I mean, so many times just finding the data is so hard. That's just not there. And sometimes there are things on this map like the historic redlining maps and things like that. So many things of that nature only applied to cities that had X number of thousands of residents. Our two largest cities in West Virginia don't even have 50,000. So there's, right. So many of these things are not there. But I was wondering, when you all were, kind of creating this website or gathering all of this information, because it's it's countrywide, it's everything in the nation. Did you have difficulties kind of getting information for the more rural states and things like that? Did you notice that jumping out at you?
Yeah, it's interesting, right? So I guess maybe before I answer that, I want to take like half a step back and say that it really makes me happy when folks are just using LandGrid, even for the basic function of just finding ownership and information that's public that they could find elsewhere, but just more easily and quickly. Because one of the main motivating like ethoses of our company, I guess I would say, is the idea that understanding like who owns the land around you, regardless of where you live in the country, should not be like a high barrier to find, right? Like it's public information, it's designed to be public, legally speaking, it's public. It should not be such a headache for somebody to know who owns the vacant building or the vacant lot or the occupied building, right? That's being rented out. Like that should not be, we don't think that that's something that should be gate kept, right? Like there's no reason for that. So it makes me really happy that that happens. And then so, okay, to your question directly, various places have various challenges, and it's been interesting to see how that's evolved. For example, California has recently been instituting privacy laws where some of the counties are actually redacting more data, so the data is getting worse there over time in some counties. There have been struggles with rural counties. You'll note, if you look on that data store site at all, you'll see the counties where we don't have coverage. One of them is Kentucky. Many counties in Kentucky we just truly don't have data for. And that's sort of like, it's an interesting state by state thing where some states have clearly invested time and resources into certain approaches where this stuff is more easily publicly available. And others sort of subcontract to mapping companies that to some level keep that data back, or they ask higher fees for it, which is really interesting to see. So I would say the obstacles that we have found nationwide are much more related to sort of like, I guess this is sort of like a nerdy term, right? But it's like, what is the data ecosystem like in a given county was more of the obstacle than like, is it rural? Although there are issues with that, right? Where it's like rural counties have fewer resources. They may not have like an IT person on staff, et cetera. But truly the obstacles that we found are much more related to like, what's the basis that all of this is built on, right? Is it based on the idea of the public should get access, or is it based on how can we do this the most cheaply, et cetera?
Yeah, for sure. And remind me, is as far as like your main sources of this data goes, because really, if I understand it correctly, that's a big if, because I am not a technology person, but it's just all of these different data sets that just kind of get overlapped to create this picture, right? So as far as your main sources, we're talking like FEMA flood maps and like Postal Service data, like it's that kind of stuff. Like what are your main sort of sources from that kind of stuff?
So overwhelmingly, the main source of information that we get is from county auditors and assessors. They're called different things, but at the county level, the data is provided. And the reason that it's so consistently provided is not because we have like a federal law, because there's no rules regarding really what needs to be collected or what format, which would make our lives a lot easier, honestly, if it was, because then everybody would be recording the same information. But as it stands, every county has discretion over what they track. However, almost every county does track it because everybody has an interest in collecting taxes, right? So that is why there is a publicly available data set. And that's often why, by the by, it's public record. It's because the ethos of the country, right, is that it should be available somewhere, what you're being taxed, what the value of your property is being assessed at, as well as who owns that property. But the core motivating factor that people collect this stuff is money, right? It's money from taxes. And so that's like the bulk. When you are looking at like parcel data, as we see on the site, that's 99 times out of 100. That's where we get it from directly. We do have, as you mentioned, in various places on the site, we have other data that we attach. So if you look under layers, you mentioned FEMA flood hazard, historic redlining. These all come from additional sites that we link to below, and we're really grateful to them that they provide us the data for use on our site, right? Like it's great to be able to collaborate in that way. But so we do have those things, and then the final piece of the puzzle is the vacancy data, building footprint information, you know, like are there buildings, what's the square footage, like those types of things, and a handful of other, we've been standardizing land use across the country, because if you go county to county, like the codes for zoning and stuff are just insanely different, right? Like sometimes it's R1, sometimes it's R.1, you know, like just like everything you can think of. So we've been standardizing that. So those are the types of things that we get from additional sources, additional vendors, I guess maybe I should say more specifically, and then we attach it to the appropriate parcels and all the parcel data that we get from the county.
Okay, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And you touched on the thing that I was just going to lead to next, which was that code data, because I just found that this morning, and I was going to ask you to kind of touch on that, because I know that's something that goes hand in hand with this and is also equally confusing. I don't know if you can find that on the screen to show people where to put that in, but that was very interesting.
Yeah, so, and then I'm going to try desperately not to make this boring, because I know people fall asleep as soon as you start to talk about codes and land use and stuff sometimes. But okay, so here's the general setup, right? In the United States, it is often the case that what you can build on a given piece of land is restricted by what we call zoning, right? Residential, commercial, industrial, idea being you don't want to build a huge factory with smokestacks in the middle of a residential neighborhood because people will be dealing with pollution forever, those types of things. That's why zoning is around, theoretically, been around for a long time. Land use is not a regulation, but it's literally just a question of what is land being used for, right? So there are cases where, especially in cities, but in many other areas, right? If you think about like agricultural versus residential zoning, like sometimes land is zoned agricultural, but it's also used as a place where people live, right? There's those kinds of things. So that's the difference between zoning and land use in a nutshell. And then as we touched on a little bit earlier, but I'll expand out a little bit on that, land use codes vary radically from county to county because everybody has a different way of accounting for this stuff. Nothing is standardized. So what we've been doing is based on the data that we get from the counties, and so you can see, for example, here, right, in this Beckley parcel I randomly chose. So from the county, we get a parcel use code of 101, and we have a description telling us that 101 means residential one family. From that information, and in some places we have other sources to draw from, but then we standardize these codes that would be the same. If you're looking, for example, in our data at 1100, anything that's zoned 1100, regardless of what county it's in, will have an 1100 designation, if that makes sense. So instead of having to, every single time you go to a different county, break out your like huge ledger of zoning and use codes, you can just say 1100 is the residential for everywhere that you're looking, if you're looking at our standardized codes. So it's a work in progress. We're refining it. So we're making it more and more specific and granular as time goes on. But we're pretty happy with even just the way that we have it currently. It's a big step forward relative to, I think it's fair to say, what most folks offer.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. There's so much information on here. Just if you scroll down that little block, there is so much information aggregated there.
Yeah.
I'm gonna remind everyone again, if you have any questions, go on ahead and drop them in the chat. I haven't seen anything else come in yet, but this is definitely a chance for you all to ask a little more specifically about this software, or even things a little more generally about parcel data, or if you have questions for the bad team as far as how parcel data does relate to these community projects. Feel free, go on ahead, and nothing is, there's no dumb questions. I will tell you off the bat, like I just said, I am not a technology person. So when I first pulled this website up, I was in exactly the same place that you all are when you first pull it up. So, but it really is user-friendly. I will say I got the hang of it fairly quickly, and I think that you all will too. I see Charles here. It says, "Can you search for state-owned properties?" Is that a functionality here?
Yeah. So I think that yes, with two caveats. First caveat, you're going to need to know the name of the state ownership, right, which can vary. So like a good example, if we were looking out west in, say, Montana, right, you would need to have some level of background knowledge that like federal ownership is split between Bureau of Land Management, you know, federally owned land. Like there's a couple different owner names. But once you know that, yes, you can search by owner to find them. And so if you have a fairly good working knowledge, you should be able to get to those. The other thing that you could do to start that journey, if you don't know already, would be to look under the overview tab, and then you can see the top ownership here on the left-hand side. And so this changes dynamic to where you're looking at. So like we're looking at a subdivision of this county, and we're seeing that the top owners, right, one of them is West Virginia University Research, one of them is the city. Interestingly, the top one is this Justice Holdings LLC, which I'm not familiar with. I hope I'm not stepping on any political third rails here, but it would be interesting to know what that goes back to, right? But so yeah, you absolutely can find public ownership that way. I'll also just note that in the future, we're actually looking at adding what we would call like a flag, a public owned yes or no, like we were looking at with the vacancy, based on aggregating all these things together, so that instead of you having to know the owner, you could just say, yes, publicly owned, and then find all of the ones that fit into the database of owners that we know that are public. So hopefully that was not too much of a monologue to answer what should be a pretty straightforward question.
No, that was very, very good. And honestly, I had the same experience when I was searching on the project that I was mentioning earlier. It's very interesting, not to be gossipy, but when you start looking at these things, you'll be surprised sometimes what comes up as these big landowners. So let's see, I've got a couple more questions coming in here from Aaron. Hi, Aaron. Regarding land use, do you also have data regarding land use restrictions, i.e. groundwater use restriction, residential use restriction, etc.?
So the shortest answer is probably no, with the caveat that in places where the county does have that data attached to the rest of the data we have, that we would keep it, right? Like we're not going to throw it out. But it's generally the case that when you're talking about land use restrictions, that stuff doesn't go with the parcel as much as it does with a map that the county owns that is like in this area that we've drawn colored in yellow, there's like a 50-foot setback requirement from the street type of thing. But generally that information doesn't travel with the parcel. And so as a result, we don't generally have it.
Okay, thank you. I've got another one from Chris. Hi, Chris. Ravenswood has a plot of land that is listed United States of America. How does Ravenswood approach questions in regard to its use? With something that's that like nebulous, how does someone approach finding that?
Yeah, well, and the interesting thing about LandGrid, and this is really tipping my hand as someone who really gets lost in the detail-oriented nature of this stuff, which is probably why I work at this company. It becomes a scavenger hunt almost immediately, right? Because the root answer to your question is, right, you start out from a perspective of like, what the heck? Like, okay, so why? And then you have to do some digging. What I generally would recommend, and actually I probably, to the person who also asked previously about restrictions, the answer to both of these is really that in those kinds of cases, I would recommend using LandGrid as your jumping off point. And then it'll give you information that you can then take to county sources or otherwise use to start digging. So I do this all the time, which is, you find a property of interest, you are like, what the heck is going on with that? You find it here, and then you want to go to the county site. And then what's really helpful with LandGrid, often this parcel number is really worth talking about. So the first thing I would say is note down under the parcel address sort of block that we have. Parcel ID is a unique identifier for that specific property in the database. And so that is the number that you want to type in to search on a county lookup to find that specific parcel. And sometimes when you do that and you go through the county sources, they have other sources of information that we haven't necessarily gathered. So for example, I might be able to pull this parcel number, go over to the county site, search by parcel ID, and then see they could have lists of restrictions in one case. They could have a transfer log, right? So you could say, okay, so it's owned by the US government now, who was the previous owner and start to dig in that way, right? Because maybe it's right? So let's talk like mining, for example, right? It could be a private holding company, and that name sends you on a trip, and you're like, oh, okay, so this holding company was around, and then they were dissolved in the 90s or whatever, right? Declared bankruptcy, cut their losses, went through foreclosure, you come to find out, right? And the U.S. picked it up by default. Or the U.S. is trying to do land assembly, right? Or it's a brownfield that the U.S. is taking control of. But, you know, I think that's sort of like the Sherlock Holmes element of this comes in once you have the property and you know what you want to look for. Then you can take that and sort of go to other places and keep looking around on the web.
That's super helpful. Thank you. As far as that ID number being like site specific, this is just me not knowing as much about parcel data as I probably should. As far as it being specific, does that apply like nationally? Like each parcel only has one ID number and it's individual nationwide, or does it kind of start over with a different serial list each state by state or county by county? How individual is that?
Pretty individual. So I know that's not a helpful answer. So let me go into a little bit more depth here. So they are individual enough that, let's say I'm going to try to do this in real time, and hopefully this will work. Otherwise, I'll look kind of silly here. But I'm going to copy up here at the top. We've got a search bar, and if you type in a given parcel number here, it'll pull it up. And this will happen nationwide. So if I had a San Francisco parcel number, I should be able to put it in here. It'll run through our insanely large database, and it'll pull it up. So in that sense, pretty good. It is also the case that because nothing is standardized nationwide, sometimes people have naming formats that are similar. So sometimes you'll get more than one hit, right? Like especially if it's a generic number and the number of digits is shorter, right? Just probability-wise. You might get more than one hit, but often it'll be like, okay, I've put in my parcel number and I've got 3 results in Texas, 1 in California, and 1 in Iowa, right? And so you can pretty quickly narrow down to the ones you want. So it's not like a perfect system, but it is close enough that you can do this search on a nationwide scale.
Okay, great. Yeah, that's good to know. I don't see any other questions here right now. I will give you all a few more minutes there to keep thinking about that. But Carrie, Nicole, and Nick, any other thoughts you all have had that you want to share before we start wrapping up? Anything like that today?
I have 2 that I would talk about, but I also will stop talking if somebody else has questions. So, no?
Hugh, go ahead.
Okay. All right, I'm going for it. So 2 things I wanted to note that are sort of like applications that I think are really interesting beyond sort of the nuts and bolts. Like I want to find property information. I want to survey whether buildings are occupied stuff. So the first thing that I'll note is related maybe more closely to that. Kelsey, you and I were talking about historic preservation prior to this. In Michigan, we have a couple folks who are actually using LandGrid as their surveying tool to note historic buildings and to do the data collection that's required to get buildings certified, right? So on one hand, this works well as a tool to identify properties that are distressed and need help in one form or another. On the other way, you can actually proactively go out. We actually also work with a group, Preservation Chicago in Chicago, and so they're going neighborhood by neighborhood to identify properties that are potentially historic by foot, and then they can come back into their offices, look at those properties more extensively, and start to do more serious, like desk-based research to submit. So one, I think that's like an interesting application, maybe outside the realm of distress, that is really fascinating, right? Like you can start to collect these lists of properties that have that should be grouped together that you want to find later, all this stuff. So that's one. Second one that I would talk about is we actually were working on a project with some folks in some neighborhoods in Dallas, which I thought was really interesting because the premise of that work was less the built environment and more using it as a tool to collect resident survey responses. So actually like door knocking and talking to folks about what they thought about their neighborhood. In that specific project, it was really interesting because the premise was these neighborhoods are underserved. Dallas is a really hot housing market, so they're particularly at risk for gentrification and displacement. And so the idea was, let's actually meet people where they're at, go to their houses and talk to them about what they want to see in their neighborhoods, so that we can then aggregate that data and float up to the top when a developer wants to come in the neighborhood, right? Say like, you know, look, it's nice that you want to build luxury condos, but the 3 top needs are like grocery store, bus stop, whatever, right? So it's interesting to think about it. And I mean, obviously COVID has thrown a wrench in a lot of those plans to do that kind of door knocking stuff. But as life returns a little bit more back to normal here, I think it's interesting to think about restarting some of those. A related project where we did door knocking with interesting results was back up in Detroit. We were a tool where people went and visited every property that was tax delinquent in the city currently. They hired Detroit residents to meet with their neighbors. The project is called Neighbor to Neighbor. If you go to our reports section in our website, there's some really nice documentation there. But again, right, like it was literally just finding out, you know, who are these people who are at risk of being foreclosed? Where are they going to go if they do get foreclosed? Did they know they were being foreclosed? Are they renting these properties? You know, there's all these questions that need to be answered. And some of it is structure related, but a lot of it, right, is like qualitative people based. And so I just wanted to like flag that that's something that can happen within the software too. It's just a question of what questions you ask and how you approach it.
That's so exciting, because I mean, it just goes to show how versatile this data, you know, is and how it can be put to use and, you know, that sort of thing. So I love that there's all the different possibilities. And the first thing that also came to my mind when you were talking about the historic preservation and the door-to-door stuff was there's, like I said, I'm an AmeriCorps member, so there are other AmeriCorps members that serve with Clio, which is sort of this historic site mapping, you know, software. And I'm just thinking those two things, you know, going hand in hand and sort of mapping all this stuff out could be so useful and so effective for this work. Yeah, which, speaking of, that was my unintentional segue to Katie's question here in the chat. So she's one of our Clio members. So she's asked, does the map show only the current land use, or are historic structures that used to stand there able to be seen somehow? What kind of historic data can be found on the site?
So the less than satisfying answer is that it's mostly a snapshot in time. It's the most current cut that exists. So we don't have a great depth of historic data. We are actually, something that really fascinates me, this is a minor tangent, but I'm going to keep it to a few minutes here. Something that really fascinates me is actually being able to track things over time, change over time in cities, right? Like it's one thing to know how much a property is worth, but it's actually in many ways more interesting to know how that property's value has changed between the last time it was assessed and now. You know what I mean? Or what was the last sale price? Or where is zoning changing? Like all those types of things. So we're actually going down the path of thinking about how do we make it easy for folks to access previous data on the site. That is something that we're sort of developing and will come out in time. However, to this specific question though, I probably should hit, I don't think I've really mentioned it very fully here, that if you happen to have a spreadsheet of properties, you can bring your own data into LandGrid and attach it to the current cut. So for example, say you've got, you know, you're working in a city, you've got 100 historic properties, and you've got a spreadsheet because you're trying to track these for some reason with a column that has addresses and a column that has current status and maybe some notes or whatever. We have an import tool where you can take that spreadsheet and actually join it by address and then attach it on the site, and you would then be able to see sort of like toggle for each property between the current stuff that we have and the stuff that you brought in. So there's definitely, if you have the data, it's definitely feasible to get it onto LandGrid, but we don't have much of it prepackaged. Yeah, that's another classic question. So it sort of is the same. What about when the addresses change over time? So the short answer is, again, like it's whatever the most current address is what we're gonna have on file. Yeah, and it is, and there's like inherent difficulty, especially because a lot of these historic records haven't been digitized at all, right? And so that's like a unique challenge for a lot of historic preservation folks. And there's no really easy answers other than the digitizing. But I would say that LandGrid is a good source to tie the current data to if you can find historic sources and corral it in some kind of digital format, which obviously is hard, so it's not a complete answer here. But those are the kinds of avenues that I would pursue. Like I'm thinking about, so I actually live in Cleveland, Ohio. Up here in Cleveland, we have a couple sources that folks have done where they've overlaid the historic plat and fire insurance maps as sort of like the base layer. And that actually does often give you the addresses historically. And then you can basically toggle on and off like a modern day street map on top of it. So that you can say, okay, it looks like this, now it looks like this. And you can go back and forth until you're like 123 Main Street used to be 123 South Vernon Street or whatever. But there's not really like a ready-made solution for that in LandGrid, I think is the straightforward answer.
Yeah, and there's also, I learned recently that rural West Virginia, a lot of places didn't even have addresses until very, like the 2000s. It was after 9/11 with Homeland Security, doing things. So a lot of places didn't even have a physical address. It was just house on 211. So the difficulties with that are insane.
Yeah, and it's really interesting. I mean, this is, it's interesting. We're sort of an interesting moment in history. I mean, obviously, I guess for a few reasons. But one of the reasons, in my perspective, is that it would really be an opportune time to put some federal money into like a WPA style funding mechanism that would actually support digitizing records. Because I'm consistently astounded at the amount of information that hasn't been digitized that sits at county courthouses. And this information would be so valuable in terms of like understanding how land has been used, is currently used, the trajectory, understanding sort of like, just being able to understand how all this stuff works together. But it's effectively impossible to do because right now your starting point is first spend 1,000 hours in the library scanning these things and putting them into spreadsheets before you can even start, right? And I'm sure this is a familiar struggle to folks who work with historic preservation. But that to me seems like such a project that would be well suited to fund on a national level and get this stuff digitized and make a big push because, it really is the reality that currently, like a lot of things that exist in those county courthouses, it takes one leaky roof, or one radiator bursting, and that's the only source of that kind of data, right? Where the only Rosetta Stone between household 211 and 123 Main Street is literally like an old musty book that's sitting in a corner that nobody is looking at, right? So, I mean, I guess that's maybe my personal soapbox, but I think it's such an interesting thing to think about how we could get that stuff updated because it's really important to digitize,
It's so important. It's not just your soapbox. Trust me, that is something that so many of us agree with 100%. And now my wheels are turning for my AmeriCorps people, like that sounds like a service project somewhere, blending those Clio maps with some with some of that data online, importing that. Oh, hey, Ben Martin. We've got another question from him. Why should an organization consider using LandGrid for their projects instead of ArcGIS Online?
Yeah, I mean, fair question. And honestly, I'm a pretty equal opportunity guy. I would say whatever works best for you is a good solution. So, in that sense, I don't feel particularly territorial. I guess I'll say why I would use it over ArcGIS Online. Cost comparable, right? It's about the same in my experience. So there's not a huge benefit either way there. I find it a lot easier to use. We I would say focus a lot on user friendliness and ease of access. So I would say an easier on-ramp for folks who aren't necessarily map savvy. And I'm going to portray my own ignorance in the next part of my answer, which is that I actually don't know. Maybe Ben, you can chime in. But we have all this stuff preloaded in, right? So my impression with ArcGIS Online, at least the version of Arc that I have, is basically bring your own data, right? So you need to find what we would call a shapefile, like a specific file format, and get that data and then pull it into the system and then figure out all the weird tweaks, right? And then clean that data so that it's usable often. And then maybe add 2 or 3 data sets together to get to where you would be just by going to LandGrid and paying an equal amount of money, right? So certainly you can. I actually like the Arc suite of tools. I use them. There's certainly applications for it. So to me, I see it less as like a competitive and more as like a complementary set. If you're able to get both, cool. If you just have ArcGIS, more power to you. But I think it's also important to think about like the democratic aspect of just making it easier and more publicly available for folks generally to have like a lower barrier to entry for this stuff, you know? And for me, it's a huge pain to load stuff into mapping programs, and that's like what I do and what I went to school for. And even it gives me a headache, right? So I guess that's what I would say.
Yeah,
I don't know if that helps, Ben. If you have follow-ups, let me know.
Yeah, I would definitely second that user friendliness. And I will say, one of my questions earlier that I was kind of planning for this was, how does this relate to GIS? Because I don't really know anything about GIS. And when I went to their website to try and find more about it, like, I was definitely confused off the bat with how to use anything. So I definitely give you all kudos for being fairly user friendly right from the get-go, for sure.
Yeah, we really try. I mean, that's really like what we're built on, is that whole idea. And you know, I often, so I mean, and I'll quickly say, I mean, I know we're coming close to the top of the hour here. You know, GIS is really just like a buzzword, I feel like, because so GIS, Geographic Information Systems, is just like a word for, you know, it's like map software. That's what we're doing here, right? Like, it's really just like another way of saying that. And so like, we are a GIS tool, Arc is a GIS tool. And a lot of these work really well together. I will also say that there's a lot of silos that happen in GIS tools, right? In that there's like problems with file formats and whatever, and it'll bore you to tears, and it'll make you tear your hair out if you're trying to go from one to the other, because I do it all the time. And so like, really we come at it from a perspective of like, we want to make it easy to get this stuff like we've talked about, but we also want to be pretty agnostic about other tools that you use, right? Like, we want to be a tool in the toolbox that plays nicely with others, rather than a solution where it's like, you've got to bring everything into here and then you're stuck in here and then you're locked in. You know, we really want to be like, you want to export this out? Cool. You want to bring stuff in? Cool. Okay, so Kim asks, what is the cost per using LandGrid? So if you are Bad Buildings affiliated, and the Bad Buildings folks can chime in here, you may be able to get in on their current setup. If you are an individual user by yourself and you want to strike out and get access to all the stuff, $10 a month. And we have a free version that you can use if you want to just use the look up the county data aspect.
Okay. And then I've got one last question here, and I think we'll probably wrap up with that one. So in West Virginia, could the oil and gas land deed researchers who are daily in the courthouse, land records be a good source, if that could be overlaid with historic preservation researchers? Just because that's such a huge proponent of the landowners, proportion of the landowners in the state. So if we could figure out a way to get them in, I feel like that would be helpful. Yeah.
For sure. And it's all about thinking about incentives, right? I mean, not that I have like a deep level of understanding, but I'm fairly familiar with how the incentive structure for these things work, right? And the reason it's not digitized yet is because effectively there's not like a profit return on it, right? It's valuable academically, it's valuable historically and sort of human-centric wise, but it's hard to get paid to do so, right? So really the trick is, how could we fund that, right? Like, what are the mechanisms for funding it, or what people are already, like you say, right? Like, if there's people already in the courthouse looking at records for one reason, how do we make it worth their while to do some additional element, right? And those are the things, I mean, that's how this is going to get done, is figuring those kinds of questions out.
Absolutely. This has been so good. Thank you guys so very much for joining us today. Definitely, like I said, if you would like to reach out to Nick, then I will include his contact information when I send out the recording and the webinar materials and all that kind of stuff. So if you want to get with him, I'll be able to share his info with you. If you have questions as far as how this relates to the Bad Buildings program, as always, reach out to Nicole or any of us, and we can help you with that. Next month, the webinar is going to be on demolition. and brownfields. You all probably remember Mr. Patrick Kirby, longtime director of the Brownfields Assistance Center. He is now with Raise International, just over the river, and he's going to talk to us next month about how demolition and brownfields go hand in hand. So that link is live now on the events page where you signed up for this webinar. You can register for the session there on that page as always, and I'll get this recording and the materials out to you as soon as I can get them processed. So thank you again, Nick. Thanks, Nicole. Thanks everybody for tuning in today. I appreciate it so much. Have a good one. Bye, everybody.
Cool. Thanks, everyone.